Ah, football. A tough sport played by tough people. It's a sport where putting your body on the line not only isn't uncommon, it's expected. And yet, even in this sport defined by physicality, Ronnie Lott was considered as tough as anybody who had ever played. In 14 years with the 49ers, Raiders, and Jets, Lott went to 10 Pro Bowls and won 4 championships, and was widely regarded as one of the greatest safeties in NFL history. But it wasn't just Lott's accolades that garnered him respect. It was his willingness to get in the game at almost any cost. It's that few players have ever withstood more pain or gone to greater lengths just to be on a football field. And that perseverance and dedication was epitomized by something that happened to him in his 5th season. Something so outlandish and so hardcore that it cemented his legacy as one of the toughest people to ever make it to the NFL. On December 22nd, 1985, in a regular season finale between the San Francisco 49ers and the Dallas Cowboys, Ronnie Lott was attempting to tackle Cowboys running back Timmy Newsome when his left hand smashed against Newsome's helmet, which caused his left pinky finger to shatter under the impact.
Ronnie Lott hurt his left hand on that play. Oh yeah, they caught it right there. I'm sure he has one of those fractures where the bone comes through the skin because there is blood involved in that thing.
Although merely listed as a broken finger, it was a brutal injury. So much so that it was later written in the Sporting News that bone fragments and parts of Lott's flesh had fallen on the field as a result of the collision. In his autobiography, Lott recounted that fateful play by stating, "My chest acted like an anvil upon impact, and my pinky splattered onto my jersey. All I saw was blood and a mashed finger." The injury was severe enough that the top part of his pinky finger had been almost completely obliterated. And yet, in spite of that, and despite the searing pain that came with it, Lott vowed that he would be in the 49ers lineup a week later when they'd play the New York Giants in round 1 of the postseason. What's interesting too is that as damaged as his finger was, there wasn't much concern expressed at the idea of him playing in the game. And if anything, it seems that most writers and football people just took it for granted that any injury involving the pinky finger was not worth fretting over. The New Orleans Times-Picayune actually labeled Lott's broken finger one of the 49ers' less serious injuries going into their matchup with the Giants. And the San Jose Mercury News responded to Lott's announcement that he'd play the next week by opining, "Of course, no football player wants to suffer the humiliation of being listed as doubtful because of an injured pinky." Privately, though, the 49ers doctors were concerned and didn't want him to play. But Lott overruled them, not only because of the stakes of the 49ers' next game, but because, as he saw it, playing through a broken finger just wasn't that big a deal in a sport where ex-players like Jack Youngblood and Larry Wilson had played through a broken leg and 2 broken wrists, respectively. In a 2011 sit-down with KNBR, Lott recounted how unfazed he was when he was told that he should sit out the next game.
We were going to go to the Giants. It was a playoff game, a wild card game, and I decided that game that we were going to play, I was like, they said, "You can't play." I was like, I'm going to tape this thing up. I'm going to tape it up. Now, the front of my finger was gone, you know, and I broke the bone in half, and I lost a piece of the bone in it. And they were like, you can't play. And I was like, "Well, what do you mean you can't play?" Again, the psyche of me is like, Larry Wilson played, Jack Youngblood played, these guys played.
Sure enough, Lott decided to follow in their footsteps and was indeed on the field when the 49ers traveled to Giants Stadium 1 week later. However, his pinky was so hurt that his entire left arm had to be heavily wrapped just so that he could move around with it. At one point in the game, Pat Summerall and John Madden, who were doing the play-by-play for CBS, took a moment to describe what it was Lott was dealing with and how the doctors had to almost reassemble his finger from scratch just to make it tangible again.
That was some description he gave us yesterday about what they had to do to get that thing back together.
Well, he really had it sewed up twice. They sewed it up once originally, sewed the nail back on that little finger, and and the finger back up. Then he had to go to a hand surgeon and have it done again, and the nail taken off, and the skin put around that bone and put it all back together. And he said the toughest thing since the injury had been the flight. He said on the flight it started to swell and throb on him, and said it bothered him more on the flight than anything else.
In the end, though, Lott's efforts were for naught, as the 49ers lost that game 17-3, and Lott, by his own admission, was not particularly effective in it, as the bandages on his arm made it difficult for him to tackle anyone. Then came the offseason, and Lott again met with doctors who more or less presented him with two choices as to what to do with his left little finger. Option A was to undergo a delicate procedure in which bones from another part of his body would be grafted onto his finger along with a pin. There'd be an 8-week recovery period, which likely would have resulted in him missing games, and the finger would still be at risk of being re-injured. But he'd have a fully operational working pinky again. Option B, simply, was to chop off the top of his pinky, which would bypass any lengthy recovery, but leave him minus half a finger. Just about everyone would choose option A. Just about every football player would choose option A. But Ronnie Lott was so against the idea of missing game time that he told the doctor to go ahead and amputate the top joint of his finger. He would later encapsulate his decision by saying, "I love the game of football so much, I didn't have to think about it." And so, when he reported to 49ers training camp in the summer of 1986, he showed up with merely 9.5 fingers. Incidentally, if you find this image of Lott's half-amputated pinky somewhat unsettling, don't feel too bad, because Lott felt the same way when his bandages were removed and he first glanced at what was left of his appendage, which to him looked a little too much like E.T.'s head. In an interview with the San Francisco Chronicle, he recalled thinking that the stump on his hand was the ugliest thing he had ever seen in his life, and said, "I was trying to laugh it off, but I felt sick. I tried to stand up, but I broke out in a cold sweat. The doctor said, 'Why don't you just sit down for a while?' It was just total shock. I thought, oh man, I should have had the pin put in. Then I realized it was all over."
Ronnie Lott is a man of courage as well as determination, and through the exercise of both, he has made himself an example to the rest of the team.
There's an interesting side aspect to Lott's amputation, which is that for years, it was an urban legend that instead of getting his finger sliced off in the off-season, Lott had actually gotten it removed in the middle of that game against the Cowboys, that the doctors had told him that they weren't going to let him play so long as his finger was that battered, and that Lott had essentially responded by grabbing a knife and chopping off the finger himself in the locker room so that he could then run back onto the field to play the second half. That version of events was erroneously reported as true for a very long time by a large assortment of outlets. For example, here's a depiction of that event from an old NFL Network countdown program.
Gross, definitely. I'm not going to call anyone who's got the stones to do that insane.
He chopped it off himself. He went in there at the buffet, chopped off his finger, said, "I'm sick of this thing being infected." It's not like somebody bit it off.
The reality isn't quite that dramatic, but when you think about it, it's actually more badass that he got it removed in the offseason, because the procedure wasn't necessary. In the mythical version, Lott chopped off his hand so that he could return to a critical game at the end of the season. But in the real version, he did it so that he wouldn't miss preseason and early regular season games. The surgery, had he gotten it, would have kept him inactive for 8 weeks, which isn't nothing, and it likely would have resulted in him missing some game time. But given his pain threshold, it's conceivable that he wouldn't have missed that much time, and the time he would have missed would have been relatively inessential since it would have come at the beginning of the year, and he'd still have 2 working pinky fingers. He got the amputation when he didn't really need to. Nonetheless, you can argue that he made the right decision for his career. If you're wondering if having a nub for a finger affected his performance, such as his ability to catch the ball, it not only didn't, He led the NFL in interceptions the very next season. He played 9 of his 14 years without half a finger, and in that time, he won 2 of his 4 Super Bowls and went to 6 of his 10 Pro Bowls. So, the amputation didn't hamper his career at all. And who knows, maybe he would have re-injured that finger if he kept it around. Maybe doing what he did was a good call from a business standpoint. From a self-care standpoint, though, not so much. For what it's worth, Lott would mostly downplay the bravery of his decision, saying that compared to what other people had sacrificed, losing half a digit wasn't worth memorializing. But there were times when he did concede that, yeah, there were moments when he wondered if he had done the right thing. In 1986, he'd even said this in an interview to the Associated Press. "We're losing the compassionate side of sports. We're becoming gladiators. If I ever become a coach, I hope I never lose sight of the fact that players are people. They feel, they have emotions. I could have all of Eddie DeBartolo's corporations, and it isn't going to buy me a new finger. It has given me a new perspective on life." And I think that keys in on the right way to look at Lott's amputation, because it exemplifies everything that's good and everything that's bad about football. The good is that it features athletes like Lott who are willing to push themselves to the limit for the sake of competition, to the point that many of them are willing to betray their own bodies in the process. The bad is that players shouldn't be presented with having to make that type of compromise in the first place, and that as sports fans, we've been conditioned to expect athletes to play through pain and to heap praise on them when they do, without necessarily considering what that means to them when they're not on the field. Ronnie Lott may very well have made a good business decision when he had half his pinky chopped off, and it was a decision that made him revered by his peers. It elevated his status as a legendary tough guy in a sport full of tough guys. But that doesn't change the fact that when he wasn't on the field, when he was living the rest of his life, he was doing so having left a piece of him behind because of his job. And that's a tough pill to swallow, even if it did give him a piece of immortality.